When it comes to British battleships, the Queen Elizabeths are quite well known. For good reason, especially when it comes to HMS Warspite. Of those ships, however, one typically goes ignored: HMS Malaya. Warspite needs no introduction. Barham has her sinking. Valiant has the mining in Alexandria, and Queen Elizabeth is the name ship. Malaya, though, this ship would fight hard at Jutland, and then later on at Calabria in 1940. However, aside from those two actions, she largely served on secondary roles, for better or worse. Malaya would, in the end, be decommissioned early and largely forgotten about, compared to her more famous sister ships. We'll hopefully change that at least a little with this video. Let's get into it now. Malaya's story began on October 20th, 1913, when the ship was laid down by Armstrong. The battleship would then launch on March 18th, 1915, and commission on February 1st of 1916, about as fast as the British could manage in the middle of the Great War. Although I suppose I should say that Malaya's story began before then. She was actually an extra ship in a manner of speaking. This is apparent when you look at her name, which stands out from her sisters, Malaya. That name relates to the British colony in modern Malaysia, the Federated Malay States. Their government paid for the construction of a battleship in November 1912. The British chose to use that money for a 5th Queen Elizabeth-class battleship, with the resulting ship named Malaya in recognition of the purchase. That aside, Malaya entered into service at a crucial moment, February of 1916, at the height of the Great War. At this point, the High Seas Fleet remained a massive threat. Neither fleet had fought a decisive battle, and every ship was needed for that possibility, especially a modern and fast battleship like Malaya. She displaced around 33,000 tons as built. On that displacement, the ship carried 4 twin turrets, a super-firing pair on the bow and another pair on the stern. Each turret carried the new 15-inch 381mm gun, for a total of 8 barrels, supported in turn by 14 6-inch secondaries in casement mountings, and 4 submerged torpedo tubes, making Malaya one of the most heavily armed battleships of her day. The armor protection was nothing to sneeze at either. A 13-inch, 330mm main belt with a deck ranging from 1 to 3 inches, 25 to 76 millimeters, depending on the location. Perhaps the most impressive thing, however, was the speed. While never quite as fast as the British wanted, Malaya could average about 23 knots, perhaps as much as 24 if really pushed hard. This on 75,000 shaft horsepower through 4 shafts, in a time when most battleships were only reaching 21 knots. A couple knots may not sound like much, but it does add up in a maneuvering fight, something Malaya would have the chance to demonstrate pretty early on in her service. After entering service in February, early 1916 would be mostly quiet. Malaya worked up and then joined with the Grand Fleet in their usual patrols, keeping a wary eye on the Germans should they try to break into the North Sea. Nothing really special here. That would change in dramatic fashion at the end of May, the Battle of Jutland on May 31st. In this action, Malaya was with the rest of her sister ships as part of the 5th Battle Squadron. Aside from Queen Elizabeth herself, that ship was in dock for overhaul and missed the battle as a result. The rest of the class, on the other hand, would see some of the fiercest fighting that day. Initially assigned to support the battle cruisers, they would be outpaced by the charge at the Germans. as well as classic signaling errors. There was a lot of conflicting information, which hardly helped matters. This would result in the 5th Battle Squadron continuing on after the battlecruisers pulled back, right into the teeth of the High Seas Fleet. In fairness, Admiral Evan Thomas, in command of the battleships, recognized the issue, and he would turn his squadron to escape. Unfortunately, this would not allow them to avoid damage. Both the German battlecruisers and the German battleships pounded the British squadron. With the exception of HMS Valiant, the British battleships all took damage. This varied from the absolute savaging of HMS Warspite to the relatively light damage to HMS Barham. Malaya came out in the middle of those two extremes. She would suffer 7 to 8 hits, depending on the source. One of those hits set a fire in her 6-inch secondary battery. This could have ended badly, to say the least. Fortunately, the fire was put out before it could get worse. The other hits did various damage to the hull and the armor. While Malaya would lose 65 men, or 63 according to Burt, the ship came out in one piece. None of the hits were crippling, unlike Warspite's rudder damage. So Malaya was able to continue on for the rest of the battle, where she fired 215 15-inch rounds and 31 6-inch shells, before heading home for repair that would last until June 24th of 1916. After which there's not much to note. The rest of World War I was spent on patrol and blockade duty, as no other major fleet actions took place, not between the British and Germans in the North Sea. As a result, Jutland would be the only major action that Malaya saw, and when the war ended in 1918, the battleship shifted to equally quiet peacetime duty. For the most part, this consisted of training and fleet exercises, as well as port visits. The typical British battleship experience, if you want to call it that. Regardless, there were a couple breaks here and there that are worth mentioning. First, a special visit to her namesake colony, Malaya, in December 1920. Then the battleship carried the last Ottoman Sultan, Mehmed VI, into exile in November 1922. After this, not much happened. Not until 1927, when Malaya went in for her first major rebuild. This primarily focused on 3 areas. The most obvious being the trunking of her 2 funnels into one larger structure. The second change was in the same area, with some minor modifications to the bridge. And the third change was less visible because it was below the waterline, that being the fitting of torpedo bulges. The refit ran from September 1927 to February 1929, after which Malaya served in the Atlantic Fleet for 5 years. Once again, not much of note occurred in this period. That is not surprising, considering world affairs in the early 1930s. While there were hotspots like Manchuria, global tensions only really began to rise in the latter half of the decade. As a result, there was little for Malaya to do until going in for her second rebuild in October 1934. And this time around, the major focus came above the waterline. The bridge was further modified, although it retained the tripod mast. More superstructure was built up around the funnel as well. Malaya lost her torpedo tubes, although she retained her original secondary battery. The anti-aircraft defense, on the other hand, was improved. 8 4-inch dual-purpose guns in 4 twin mounts. These were carried around the funnel, 2 to a side. The ship also gained 2 octuple 40mm pom-pom mounts, carried next to the funnel, in addition to some 50 caliber machine guns. However, the most striking change came behind the funnel. 2 hangars were fitted, one on either side of the funnel. Each hangar could hold one aircraft, either a modified swordfish or a supermarine walrus. Another could be carried on the deck, and a fourth on the catapult, for a potential maximum of 4 aircraft. Malaya was the first British battleship fitted with hangars of this style. Unfortunately for all this work, Malaya wouldn't have her machinery spaces overhauled. She was scheduled for it, but Warspite was in more dire need of that work, so the money and equipment allotted to Malaya would instead go to Warspite. That just leaves one note for this overhaul. A bit of a question mark, actually. Malaya is often stated to have her deck armor increased to 5 inches over the magazine and 3.5 inches over the engine room. Burt is notably silent on this, making no mention of up-armoring the ship. Friedman, meanwhile, cites Malaya being planned for the same overhaul that Barham got. That is 4 inches of armor over the magazine, with an added note of 2.5 inches over the machinery space. So make of that what you will. Regardless, let's move on. Malaya came out of her overhaul in December 1936 and rejoined the Mediterranean fleet in January 1937. For the next 2 years, the ship continued on as she had before. There were only 2 events of real note. First, a collision with a Dutch merchant on the way to the Mediterranean in February 1937. This required repairs that delayed her departure until July 1937. The second event, meanwhile, came in August 1938, when Malaya was based in the Mandate of Palestine due to the usual religious conflicts in the area. Aside from that, things were largely uneventful, until, that is, September of 1939. When German panzers rolled into Poland, Malaya was still based in the Mediterranean. This would prove to be short-lived. In early October, the battleship was shifted to the Indian Ocean, specifically to join Hunt's 4 German raiders, notably Graf Spee. This formation would eventually be designated Force J, and also included HMS Glorious and HMS Ramillies, alongside various destroyers. Unfortunately for the British, this ultimately came to nothing. Graf Spee returned to the Atlantic and was eventually scuttled after the Battle of the River Plate, so Malaya shifted to the Atlantic in December 1939 for convoy escort duty that ran through May 1940, at which point Malaya was moved back to the Mediterranean. Soon after this, her second and final major surface action would arrive, the Battle of Calabria on July 9, 1940. This is a famous action, but more for Warspite than Malaya. Malaya did her best to keep up, but her older machinery slowed the ship down. Not as bad as Royal Sovereign, also present for the action, but it was enough. Malaya was consistently just outside effective range to fire on the Italian battleships, as evidenced by Warspite's hit on Cesare being one of the longest range in history. And Malaya was further behind the battle than Warspite. Her bigger contribution came in dividing Italian fire. Had they focused everything on Warspite, they might have done some damage. Instead, the Italian battleships split their fire. Still, as the battle came to an end, Malaya came out unharmed. The rest of 1940 would be substantially quieter. Escort missions and shore bombardment. This continued into 1941, although there was some excitement in February. Malaya joined in bombarding Genoa on February 9, 1941, with one of her shells punching into a church and failing to detonate. That armor-piercing shell is now a museum piece in Italy. More excitement came a month later in March. First on March 7th, when Malaya was escorting an Atlantic convoy. Scharnhorst and Gneisenau came across the convoy and promptly turned around. This demonstrated the importance of the old dreadnoughts on escort duty. The Germans weren't willing to tangle with them, despite the speed advantage. The second event, on the other hand, would be less fortunate. On March 20th, Malaya was torpedoed by U-106. This caused a 7-degree list to port, but the ship managed to make it to safety in Trinidad. After emergency repairs, Malaya sailed for the New York Navy Yard. The United States wasn't at war yet, but they still repaired British ships, so Malaya went into dock. She would leave on July 9th, 1941, to escort another convoy, arriving back in Britain on July 28th. After this, Malaya spent the rest of the war on secondary duty. She helped escort Atlantic and Malta convoys from the middle of 1941 through the summer of 1943, with a break from October to December of 1942 for another refit. This saw her aircraft facilities removed with extra 4-inch guns in place of the catapult. Regardless of the upgrades, however, Malaya saw no more notable combat. She would ultimately be put into reserve in August 1943. Worn out and no longer capable of fleet actions, she would remain in this position through early 1944, with her 6-inch guns removed and used as a target for training, including for bouncing bombs, one of which punched a hole in the ship's side. Malaya's last hurrah, as it were, came with the Normandy invasion. She was reactivated as a reserve bombardment ship, with a short stint on September 1st, bombarding an island off St. Malo. After this, the ship returned to reserve for the rest of the war, before being turned into an accommodation ship in May 1945, a role she remained in until ultimately being decommissioned in 1947, and sold off for scrap on February 20th, 1948. Malaya saw relatively little combat, but the ship performed well and without complaint, and there's certainly nothing wrong with that. Thank you for watching. Remember to like, comment, and subscribe if you enjoy the content, and I'll see you in the next one.